Yarmuth for 30 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and congratulations on your election. It's a great pleasure to be here today, and I could spend the next half hour responding to my colleague from Iowa. I think it's fascinating that just one comment that he talks about reading the Constitution and then talks about how this is an unconstitutional bill. Well, obviously, he apparently stopped at Article 2 and didn't get to Article 3, which stipulates that the judiciary and the Supreme Court ultimately decides what is constitutional in this country, not members of Congress. And the Constitution was read today. I'm glad it was. It's always good to remind ourselves of this great foundational document that we all respect, that all of us, all 435 members of the House, swore to protect and defend yesterday. And in the Constitution, in Article 1, Section 5, it says each House may determine the rules of its proceedings. And yesterday, the Republican majority in the House put forth a group of rules changes that will determine how this Congress will operate over the next 2 years. And it was fascinating, in light of our discussion about health care, in light of our discussion about the costs of health care, that one of the things it did, these rules changes that the Republicans passed, is basically to vest extraordinary power in one member of the House of Representatives to determine essentially what the cost, what the deficit or the budget implications of a particular piece of legislation might be. And the relevance of this to the debate we're in now about the Republicans' proposal to take away all of the privileges and rights and benefits granted by the Affordable Care Act that we passed in the 111th Congress, and I was proud to support, is that one of the things that it said was that if there is a vote to repeal the health care bill, the Affordable Health Care Act that we passed last year, that we basically decide that we don't have to abide by pay-go rules. In other words, saying that just because the Congressional Budget Office determined that the Affordable Health Care Act will save the taxpayers $230 billion over the next 7 or 8 years, and then another $1 trillion in the following 10 years, that we don't have to make the same kind of adjustments that we do for other kinds of additional expenditures. Because where the Republicans, through the Republican philosophy, is that if you reduce revenues in any way to the government, that's fine, and it doesn't affect the deficit. Now, a lot of the debate we had last Congress over the Health Care Act, I heard time after time after time, and we heard this with tax cuts and many other things, that, oh, a business can't operate like this, a family can't operate like this. Well, in fact, I think in this particular case, that analogy is really relevant. Because if I have a family, a two-income family, and all of a sudden one of us loses our job and loses our income, it's really interesting that we could take the position that, oh, it didn't affect our budget, it didn't affect the family deficit, just that loss of revenue didn't matter. All we're concerned about is how much we spend. All we're concerned about is the expense side. What the Republicans have basically done is to say, under this new regime, this new set of rules that they passed yesterday, that there are two separate ledgers, one dealing with expenditures, one dealing with revenue, and they don't affect each other. It's an astounding philosophy of operation that we're about to embark on. Under this new rule, when the Bush tax cuts for the very wealthy expire in 2 years, we would not have to account for that loss in revenue to the federal deficit, even though when we start writing checks and we start trying to borrow money to pay for the deficit, we're going to have to come up with that money. They say, no, it doesn't affect the deficit. If we repeal the Affordable Health Care Act, which the CBO says will save $1.3 trillion over the next 2 decades, that's money that we aren't going to have to borrow from somebody else. They say, oh, that's not part of the budget.